chances of a sequel living up to the original seems like a coin flip sometimes. On one hand, we have legendary titles like Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat 2, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 that help define franchises that continue to endure in some form or another to this day. On the other, we have Brutal Unleashed Above the Claw, Rise 2 Resurrection, Power Punch 2. Does that count as a sequel? I'm gonna count it. This episode, as well, is a sequel inside a sequel. Firstly, we'll be talking about a pair of games with special emphasis on the successor. Second, as many of you longtime watchers know, this series started with a Season 0. 5 episodes of questionable quality you can see if you subscribe to the Patreon at the $5 tier. One such episode was today's subject, whose execution I slightly fumbled and hope to do justice today. Developed and published by Sega in 1993 for the Genesis and 1995 for Sega CD, today we're talking about Eternal Champions and Challenge from the Dark Side. I'm Eric J. Chucky, and welcome to Violent Profiles, where we discuss obscure fighting games and the rosters that define them. If you could resurrect that like button with a quick tap and subscribe to the channel to see future videos the second they drop, I'd be willing to grant you your own return to life to complete your unfinished business. Leave a comment and let us know your favorite Eternal Champion or a game you'd like to see us cover in the future, and share the video with anyone you think might enjoy it. I'd appreciate it, and it's free for you. Much like the Sega CD game itself, this video is more of a remake than a sequel. I covered the more fleshed out bios from Challenge from the Dark Side in the original version of this episode, so you're going to see a lot of the same ground covered this time around, though I will point out any discrepancies between the two when they crop up in classic Violent Profiles fashion. Our story begins with the Eternal Champion, who is driven to use his great power to snatch warriors with the potential to change the world just before the moment of their deaths. They're whisked away to the Eternity Complex, where they will do battle in a tournament to see who is the strongest. The champion only has enough juice to change fate once, so only one may return to life, and it should be the one among them who is most likely to succeed in fixing the future. The champion himself is a being seemingly as old as time, serving as the final test for your chosen combatant. This is complicated in the sequel as the Eternal Champion discovers another entity with his finger on the scales, the Dark Champion. This wicked mirror has been personally killing the other potential champions, as well as accumulating his own insidious warriors called the Infernals to keep the future from changing, leaving the Eternal and his fighters in a loop. Once the Eternal catches on, he alters his plan slightly to make it more of a war between good and evil. This doesn't change the game's approach at all. There wasn't enough money or time to bring lead designer Michael Latham's vision fully to life. Both champions are only playable via cheat code, and thus neither have a proper ending. It's not their tournament to win, after all. As for the main roster, let's discuss characters who appear in both games first, starting with Jonathan Blade of 2030 AD. Born in Syria, raised in Africa, and earning his reputation in New Chicago, the towering bounty hunter known as Blade was once a government official who lost his position after an admittedly short fuse burned to its limit. The perp he'd been pursuing was beaten to death's door in frustration, and Blade had to turn in his badge. After years of funneling his rage into police-adjacent work, the Syrian government asked for his help in collecting a rogue scientist. This chemist had created a devastating virus and was threatening to release it if Syria didn't stop their own bioexperimentations, and Syria wasn't too keen on either outcome, but Blade only agreed on the conditions that the government would not get directly involved. Rising above his hot-headedness, Blade managed to convince the scientists to stand down and hand over the vial so they could negotiate maturely. Cue Syrian government agents peppering both men with lasers and destroying the vial in the process, effectively releasing the virus themselves. Blade is a beefy boy wielding Kenpo or something like it, and relying on the blade launchers on his arms as well as several force fields and projectile debilitating effects. Use this to secure the Genesis ending, and Blade saves the scientist and the vial before beating the brakes off of the Syrian agents. He confronts his betrayer, but in doing so realizes he has only fed into the rage that ruined his career, and that peace is the only path forward. Syria's government undergoes radical reform, establishing a World Peace Council with Blade as the president, which eventually establishes stability for the entire globe. A bit more realistically in the Sega CD sequel, Blade catches the vial and uses his lasers to stun the Syrian officers. Considering his options, he decides to leave with the scientist and save his life, as well as keeping the virus out of an unpredictable government's hands. After the virus is completely destroyed, Blade returns to his life as a bounty hunter, thwarting vengeance-seeking Syrian assassins for the rest of his days. I actually kind of like that Blade has to make a sacrifice in his updated ending. A lot of the original endings wrap things up in too nice a package, as though they took anachronistic inspiration from that Penny Arcade strip where the Reapers from Mass Effect turned into ice cream. Blade did the right thing. The world was saved. But sometimes doing the right thing means you have to keep fighting afterward. Younger me didn't like Blade much, probably because of the very uniform bodysuit and stiff moves, but with the updated speed and Challenge from the Dark Side, he's not bad at all. Plus, he kinda looks like LeVar Burton. Jedha Max hails from 1899 amidst the Chinese Boxer Rebellion. She herself isn't Chinese, of course, being the cousin of Tsar Nicholas II and Russian through and through. Jedha Max isn't even a real name, it's something she adopted to play up the allure and excitement of her high wire act. As it happens, Jedha's political connections weren't exclusive to her family. She herself was something of a rebel and heavily involved with trying to turn the Yihai Kuang from their mission of driving out foreign influence before it cost more innocent lives, or even kicked off a world war. While compassion was her primary motivator, she was also sure Russia wouldn't survive outright conflict with China. Unfortunately, as she neared talks of peace, a Yihai Kuang radical sabotaged both her wire and the safety net below it, causing Jedha to tumble to her death during her troops' performance for Emperor Guangxu. Jedha mixes Savat and Penjok Silat into a predictably acrobatic style and a small amount of psychokinesis that allows her to phase into a super fast mode that disrupts enemy controls and choke you with her sleeves. But good old-fashioned boomerangs and climbing on the ceiling also suit her arsenal just fine. Win the game with her and she avoids the sabotage and helps negotiate for peace in both China and Russia, eventually installing progressive forms of government in both. Challenge from the Dark Side mentioned specifically that she was unable to prevent wars in either country, but instead inspired freedom fighters to balance the scales in favor of an ultimately peaceful conclusion that eventually spread to the world at large. I always thought Larson Tyler was cool. Something about the classic gangster look is enticing, with the square jaw and the trench coat. Even though I'm not usually a fan of mob fiction, Larson being a guy trying to do good even when his employers aren't exactly on the up and up speaks to me in a way.
Boop.
Despite working for one of the most powerful crime bosses in Chicago, while Larson put his cat burglary skills to use snatching prizes and planting evidence, he would never be persuaded to kill. This is where his Mantis-style kung fu comes into play, giving Mr. Tyler the opportunity to subdue his opposition instead of taking them out for good. I'm gonna assume the bullets in his challenge from the Dark Side machine gun move are rubber. Apparently that didn't sit well with his boss, as Larson was sent to deliver some false evidence to the hospital bed of a convalescing rival crime boss. Only when he got there, it wasn't a mafioso in recovery, but the incorruptible chief of police, and he quickly realized the package wasn't innocuous sabotage, but a bomb.
Somebody set up us the bomb!
Too late to ditch the explosive, Larson and the chief die in one grisly explosion along with most of the hospital staff and patients. If you battle the Eternal Champion and earn a return to life with him, however, he has just enough time to either toss the offending incendiary so it explodes harmlessly in the sky above Chicagoland, thus impressing the chief of police long enough to make a compelling offer instead of incarcerating him for his crimes, or to disarm the bomb, an act witnessed by a visiting reporter who spreads the word of Larson as a hero. In either case, he becomes the head of a special task force built to dismantle organized crime, and is so effective that it inspires America and other countries to create reform of their own law enforcement to do the same. I would now like to talk about Xavier Pendragon because I think he's cool in spite of him being a huge nerd. Perhaps because of it. See, Xavier... Xavier? Let's go with Xavier. Xavier tried and failed at a bunch of career paths before pursuing the scientific craft of alchemy. He was convinced he'd find out how to turn lead into gold, but instead he discovered a formula for an unlimited, clean-running source of energy. The game doesn't mention what exactly that is, but I gather it's green and glowy. Of course, since he's living in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, instead of Xavier's discovery being celebrated, he's burned at the stake for his witchcraft by the rest of the townsfolk. The manual describes Xavier's fighting style as a cane-focused hapkido, and something worth mentioning is that each fighting style represented has a little blurb telling us about its historical significance as we understood it in the mid-90s. That's neat. Eternal Champions had what they called a martial arts expert on staff as a consultant, and you can see it represented in the exact style of many of the strikes that other games wouldn't bother paying as much attention to for a few more years. On the other hand, the manual also insists that Xavier's magical abilities are purely scientific, and that includes teleportations, body swapping, and turning people into gold. Turning people into gold isn't science, man. It's strange and mystical power, like turning beavers into gold with a magic watch. Would you like to hang out with someone like that?
No! Get out of here with that watch! Lay off the poor beavers, will ya? Jeez!
Good thing there are no beavers in either game, so Xavier is still a cool guy in my book. Beat the game with him and he gets returned to being burned at the stake, but has the insight to ask for his equipment to be burned with him. The idiotic zealots agree since it's all evil witch stuff to them, and this allows Xavier to use his amulet, which contains a shard of the power source, to resonate with his entire supply and cause a massive explosion of science, I guess. So much science that it causes Xavier to become a master of time travel, and he uses his great knowledge to right wrongs throughout history. Challenge from the Dark Side also adds the tidbits that his escape ended the witch hunts early, since the nutjobs in Salem take the fireball as a sign they killed the last warlock, as well as giving him a cool owl familiar to go with him on his time wizard adventures.
Magic's just science that we don't understand.
Right, I meant time scientist adventures. Sorry. Hailing from 50,000 BC, Slash the prehistoric hunter was one of the more evolved intelligences among his clan. This made him a better hunter and fighter, being able to anticipate his opponent whether they were a rival Neanderthal or canny prey. It also allowed him to come up with agricultural plans that would keep his people fed without necessitating dangerous hunts or even risky trips to gather vegetables and other supplies away from home. Seeing no benefit to Slash's radical concept of free time, the village elders shot down every suggestion he put forth, and when he eventually spoke out against him, they had him stoned to death. This humble cave person enters our midst wielding a martial art known as Pain, which is basically an admission that he predates organized fighting styles and just does his best with his big nasty club. Use Pain to secure victory, and Slash will take the techniques learned from allies and opponents to fight off his attackers and light his club aflame. This is a technique learned from Xavier specifically, and it's represented in Challenge from the Dark Side by giving Slash fire and ice club attacks. Perhaps Slash hails from the prehistoric version of the Windy City. Once that stunt captures his people's attention, he inspires them to entertain his ideas. The elders are ousted as leaders and Slash is put in their place. Not only do his people begin to farm earlier than our own timeline, but he encourages them to visit other clans and further lands and share their bounty, uniting the world as a global village and ending racism before it could even begin. Shadow Yamato looks a lot cooler in the first Eternal Champions game, and being the only character to get a significant visual overhaul, it stands out. I get that it was to connect her more strongly to her spin-off experts, but that game wasn't good enough to justify messing with a great unique costume. Much like many of us in the modern era, Shadow came to understand how much her company actually valued her work, and that if she underperformed at all, she would immediately receive her severance. Since Ms. Yamato worked for the Black Orchid Corporation, who is definitely not a stand-in for the Yakuza, her work was assassinations, and her severance would be a tumble off the 101st floor of the Black Orchid headquarters. Unfortunately, this realization dulled her killer's edge instead of sharpening it, and the Black Orchid caught up with her to seal her fate. That is, until the Eternal Champion intervened. Should Shadow combine her knowledge of Taijutsu, a forerunner to the modern Judo, and classic ninjutsu to secure victory, she evades her boss's attack, providing them the demise originally intended for her. In the original game, Shadow goes to the police and confesses her role in the Black Orchid, helping to oust not only their presence in Japan, but that of similar organizations worldwide. The Challenge from the Dark Side ending, however, sees her joining the Japanese-American-Netherlands United Security Organization, or JANUS if you're nasty, to be on their crack team of experts. If the game had been good, and Sega Japan hadn't been so narrow-focused on Virtua Fighter that it refused to see success with a different franchise, this might have been a cool little teaser. As it stands, it's more of a gross reminder of what could have been. Let's scoot into the far future, the year 2345 to be exact. Rax Coswell is a Muay Thai kickboxer who sees his sport overwhelmed by the bloody new sensation of cyborg fighting. Since partially robot bodies can take more damage, fans get to see more violence before their mechanical systems fail and the match is over. As he is the headband-wearing member of the Eternal Champions roster, Rax wants nothing more than to seek real competition and achieve championship glory. So he undergoes painful and invasive surgery to become a cyborg himself. The fighter's dreams are realized, but when a scumbag promoter realizes he could make more money in the unstoppable Rax losing, he finds a way to remotely implant a virus in Coswell's brain, shutting his entire system down so that his opponent can deliver the killing blow. Before we continue, I gotta talk about the elephant in the room. Let's get my guy out here. Rax apparently stands for Robotic Artificial Exoskeleton. Fine. But was Rax the man's name before he got cyborg surgery and he just retrofitted it to a catchy acronym? Did he have a different first name, or was Coswell a mononym and Rax is more like his stage name, a la the Animal Batista? Perhaps this is why they removed the explanation of the acronym in the Challenge from the Dark Side manual, but then again they also added in periods after each letter as though it still was. Both of Rax's endings involve him destroying the transmitter that activates his virus and defeating his opponent, though the sequel draws things out and makes it more dramatic. Not long after, cyborg fighting was made illegal, and Rax's original meat-on-meat sport returned to the fore, though you can't uncyborg yourself, so Rax was left without a path. In Challenge from the Dark Side, Rax goes back to school and gets his degree in robotics, becoming an advocate for and inspiration to all the people of the world who found themselves maligned because of their chrome. In the original game, he just cries about it, I guess. Harsh. Another one of my favorites on the roster is Midnight, real name Mitchell Middleton Knight. A London-born biochemist, 1967 found Mitch on loan from Interpol working with the CIA on a virus that would weaken the infected to the point of death, where they would remain until given the antidote. I'm not sure what he thought they were going to do with the virus, but the US wanted to deploy it in the Viet Cong water supply to bring a swift end to the Vietnam War, and that didn't sit right with Dr. Knight. He stole the formula and all remaining samples and attempted to flee, but was cornered at the local airfield/chemical storage vat repository, where he and the virus fell into into a toxic bath. The new combination turned Mitchell into a vampire, and while his newfound strength allowed him to flee back to London, it didn't make it any easier to discover a cure. For 130 years, Midnight toiled away as his body rotted, his refusal to drain the life force of innocent living beings taking its toll on his physique. Just as he was upon his final breakthrough, an Interpol agent found his hiding place and drove a magnesium stake through his heart, killing him. Midnight practices his own variation of Jeet Kune Do, which is fine, just don't expect him to execute many Bruce Lee-inspired moves. He has powers you'd expect from a vampire, such as a hypnotizing gaze and turning into mist. Using these to find success grants you one of two variant endings. In Eternal Champions, Midnight drains his attacker of life force but stops before killing him, moving to Italy to figure out a sequence for the cure. Others who have become affected by the same virus can be saved by it, but because he used his own blood as part of the solution, it will never do anything more than stave off the necrotizing effects. Still, these efforts allow him to join a global health organization and use his knowledge to help eliminate most serious illnesses from the world. However, in Challenge from the Dark Side, Midnight is forced to drain and kill his attacker, using that strength to fight off the other Interpol operatives that pursue him. He flees instead to Scotland, where he finds his virus has spread more rapidly than expected, and a terrorist cell of vampires is trying to convert all living people to members of their kind. Midnight's destiny was not to cure the disease, as it turns out, but to keep this once noble organization at bay so that normal folks can continue to live in safety. The final member of the original 9, Trident, was not named for the delicious brand of chewing gum which I was glad to see still exists on store shelves today, but instead the 3-pronged weapon that replaces one of his hands. The art suggests it's his right, but the in-game sprite changes depending on which way you're facing, as is tradition. Hailing from 110 BC, Trident was created by the Atlanteans, who lived in tense company with their neighbors, the Romans. The Romans were committed to see Atlantis sunk into the sea, and knowing that Rome had superior warfare, the Atlanteans scrambled for a solution. The first was devising technology to allow them to live in peaceful harmony among the waves. The second was to try and talk the Romans down, suggesting they both cohabitate on land and sea as a bargaining chip. The third was their manufactured champion, Trident. The Romans wanted no part of sea life, but instead of all-out war, agreed to a contest of single combat for who would remain on the earth and who would be squatting in Poseidon's backyard. Of course, the Romans rigged the fight to crush Trident with a giant pillar, defeating him and exiling all of Atlantis from solid ground. The nature of Trident's creation is unclear, other than he is some sort of fish man that can turn into liquid and appears to have some kind of bioelectric powers. His martial art of choice is capoeira, but the manual doesn't care it wasn't invented until 1,000 years or so after his creation, so why should you? Win the first game with Trident and he refuses to kill his Roman challenger, finally convincing both peoples to live in harmony and preventing all world wars because the Atlanteans figured out space travel early. Which is a great way to win a game of Civilization, but I'm not sure that's how it works in real life. Perhaps that's why in his Challenge from the Dark Side ending, his words fall on the deaf ears of the bloodthirsty. Trident is forced to kill the Roman champion as he rises to finish the fight, and in his disgust, he and most of the Atlanteans sink themselves beneath the waves anyhow, to separate from the barbarism of the surface world and force the Romans to live with their shame. In that way, Trident has the worst ending of the benevolent crew. The Eternal Champion plucked him from the brink of death only for him to fail and give up after being resurrected.
It's so gratifying to leave you wallowing in the mess you've made. You're screwed. Thank you. Bye.
We bridge now into the new characters, starting with Sophia de Medici, better known as Riptide. No, stop it, Vance Joy. What are you trying to do? Get me copyright struck? Riptide abandoned her famous Italian banking family / political dynasty and the marriage they arranged for her to sail the high seas. Piracy became her forte, and she was a fearsome rival to even the Corsairs. By 1566, she'd made enough enemies that some were starting to come for her head, in particular a man named Hannibal. When Riptide discovered some of his buried treasure, he killed her with a shovel and followed it up by wiping out the entire de Medici family, altering the course of Italy and the wider world. So here's the thing about our girl Sophia here.
My pussycat has crabs.
Not only is she a pirate with unerring accuracy when throwing daggers, not only is she a capable treasure hunter who fights with Kaju Kenbo, the 1940s Hawaiian mixed martial art, combining disciplines of karate, jujitsu, kenpo, and bojitsu, but she has water magic. This game likes to casually leave out tiny details like that, maybe all the better to keep you on your toes when someone summons a tidal wave mid-match. Beat the game with her and Riptide turns the tide against Hannibal, returns to her ship so that she and her crew can dispatch Hannibal's furiously loyal sailors, and then returns to Italy to create an empire of anti-piracy and oceanic preservation that saves the world from itself for centuries to come. Raven Jandar might be the best attempt at a culturally sensitive voodoo character the 90s FGC could have hoped to receive. I'm not going to say they did or didn't pull it off, that's for people who aren't me to decide. But you can see the effort at play here, and that's got to count for something. Raven is a member of the Arawak people dwelling in the Caribbean. A beloved healer and priestess, she possesses a magical hourglass that allows her to manipulate time. But she uses it sparingly as it drains the very life force of its wielder. When her village was sacked by Carib raiders, she was among those captured and taken away to Trinidad. Despite being bound in service to the raiders, she she became beloved among them as well for her kind demeanor and healing power, which rubbed their own aging high priest Raknuk the wrong way. A known practitioner of dark arts, Raknuk claimed to fall ill and called for Raven to aid him. When she did, he used his magic to manipulate the hourglass, stealing her life away and funneling it into him. Raven fights with a mixture of meditative Xing-Yi Kung Fu and Taekwondo, though what I find far more fascinating is her time manipulation magic accomplished through the hourglass. This is a 2D fighter on the Sega CD in 1995, grasping at what Mortal Kombat's Geras wouldn't accomplish until 2019. And I'm not sure I've ever seen a character who messed with the literal time clock. Scintillating. If Raven is victorious and sent back to the moment of her death, she uses her time magic to reflect Raknuk's spell back upon him. He disintegrates into grains of sand that are whisked into the hourglass, completing and perfecting it as it holds balance of both good and evil. While the hourglass would no longer drain her energy and allow Raven to right all the injustices throughout time, she recognizes how dangerous such a tool could be, especially in the wrong hands. Thus, in her wisdom, she uses its power to travel to the Eternity Complex, where she receives training from the Eternal Champion on how best to have a judicious hand in the affairs of time. In contrast, challenged from the dark side's new character Ramses III seems to be partially inspired by the real-life pharaoh, but their similarities are minor at best. Both oversaw the building of several temples, both were assassinated, but the real Ramses III reigned for a very long time, and his connection to the throne worsened Egypt's decline until his throat was cut, whereas the one in-game would have led Egypt to prosperity had he lived longer, and he was executed by being tossed into the river, having never learned how to swim. Ramses, for whatever reason, uses hungar as his style of choice, which works well with his rod and sickle simulating the nunchaku that are frequently used with this style. He also summons powers based on iconic creatures and deities of Egypt to decimate his foes, but that shouldn't come as a surprise. Of course Ramses III has sorcery. He's a pharaoh. Can't they all summon phantom snakes in the light of the sun? Don't even start with me, Otto. If Ramses wins, he kills his attacker and weeds out any dissenters in his court, having them beheaded. Egypt develops advanced technologies which Ramses orders be left in various burial chambers and tombs within his pyramid so future explorers can take them and use them to benefit modern people. I don't know why he didn't just write it down or directly share his discoveries with other cultures like Slash. Ignoring literally every other problematic implication of this, it just seems like a woefully inefficient way to safeguard the future. Let's move on to Dawson McShane. Born in Scotland, young Dawson left home at the age of 15 to become a gambler happy to settle disputes with both fists. This lifestyle led Dawson across Europe and into the Americas following the gold rush. McShane frequently hit up boom towns to engage with the high-stakes casinos that cropped up within them, winning big before moving on to the next vista and the next score. That is, until he showed up just in time to see the local sheriff's house on fire. Dawson dove in to save the man, but it was too late. The dying sheriff pinned his badge to McShane's chest in gratitude, and Dawson swore revenge. Unfortunately, while he was able to track down the perpetrators, the Jenkins family, they were anticipating his counterattack and strung him up before they could be brought to justice. Dawson fights with an art of his own creation dubbed Shoto-Wando, incorporating Shotokan karate, kickboxing, tai chi, and the reckless lawlessness of barroom brawling. He throws knives, rolls around, spits tobacco to gross out his enemies, and whips his surprise ponytail shuriken at folks. McShane's ending is an extended sequence describing how he outsmarts the Jenkins family before executing the last outlaw with a well-placed shotgun blast, and concludes that he became the most feared lawman in the West, but doesn't go into much detail about his efforts. Dawson's story could have used another 10 minutes in the oven, I guess is what I'm saying. Finally, we come to the secret characters. For a change of pace, let's talk about the bizarre animals they felt the need to include. It's briefly mentioned that the Eternal Champion brought them to bear against the Dark Champion because he is a master of the natural world. This seems like a flimsy excuse just to have silly playable animal fighters. They have minimal attacks and special moves and do miserable damage, but each of them is a much smaller hitbox and that gives them a defensive advantage. Yappy the dog once belonged to a rich New York woman who died tragically. She left her fortune to him, but an evil relative tossed him out onto the street to claim the puppy's prize. In vengeance, Yappy attempted to sever the evil woman's brake lines, but was crushed under the weight of the car as it unexpectedly rolled backward. Should he somehow win this tournament of time-lost champions using the adopted art of Shih Tzu Fu, taught to him by the other dogs at his original shelter, Yappy returns to 1950, is more careful about his sabotage, and eventually learns that the woman collided with an abandoned gas truck, her car consumed in a yellow fireball that harmed nobody else. The killer was never found, Yappy's fortune was returned to him, and the pup lived happily ever after. An uncomfortably naked creature from 1902, Zuni the circus monkey was the only witness to a gas lamp falling over and setting fire to the big top. When he tried to warn his trainer, one of the act's elephants accidentally squashed him, and the horrified crowd was consumed by flames. Bring him success in the contest of the Eternal Champions, and instead of going under the elephant, he climbs on top of it and commands it to suck up a bunch of water in its trunk, putting out the fire before anyone could be harmed. As the audience thinks this is part of the act, they go wild with applause, and the circus begins using controlled fires for Zuni and the elephant to show off their talents, making them both rich and famous for the rest of their days. Krispy the chicken is... man, I can't believe this is still the same video. Krispy the chicken's tale has a bit of dissonance. His in-game bio goes on at length about how Krispy learned the fate of a chicken is to be devoured and studied the ways of the ancient barnyard martial art egg foo to strike back against those who would consume him and his fellows. But in his ending, he fends off an attack helicopter with the aid of the rest of the barnyard and some mounted guns that I guess happened to be there. Krispy retired to a commune in the 70s and made a lot of money on Wall Street in the 80s, but then lost it all in a 90s bank scandal and found himself on Skid Row selling eggs for liquor. Despite his ignoble end, he remains renowned for reforming the quality of life for all livestock. Giant Bomb says he was killed during a helicopter strike in Taiwan, which tracks with his ending, but I can't say for sure where they sourced that from. Our next animal contender is Slither, the prized pet of the Old West Snakebite Saloon. He learned how to fight from watching barroom brawls and, being a snake. He was my favorite critter to play, with a cool venom spit and awesome swallow grapple move that actually does tons of damage. The bartender treated Slither like a son, and he even let him help bounce rowdy ingrates through the saloon's front doors. One night, a desperate robber broke in, and Slither tried to stop him, but took a bullet for his troubles, with the bartender following soon after. Should he triumph in the tournament, he instead sneaks around the criminal's neck to choke him out. In trying to pull Slither away from his throat, the burglar drops his gun, and the bartender draws his own piece to put the bastard down. Slither and the bartender lived out the rest of their days as best friends, and damn it, that's the kind of quality content I started this show to see. Brings a tear to your eye. The last critter on the roster is Hooter, an owl who was once the familiar of a powerful witch named Vapsian. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. Since he was living in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, being a witch didn't exactly work out for him. Hooter stayed at the fringes of zealot settlements, watching and trying to discern the best strategy to employ his owl Kwon-Do for the sake of revenge. I feel like there's a quote about that.
If you're looking for revenge, you could start by digging 2 graves.
Ah yes, his frequent attendance of the burnings was noted, and the zealots assumed he was witch-adjacent, and he was tossed into the fire. Hooter is neat because he doesn't have a jump. He can just fly around midway up the screen anytime he wants. Smart of them to not let him fly all the way to the top, that would be way broken. If he finishes the fight, he is granted mercy by Xavier, the warlock at the stake where Hooter is also burning, whose ending takes place exactly as it did before. The two become best friends and travel through time together, righting wrongs and singing songs. I made up the song part, but I just want it to be true. Alright, 4 more secret fighters and then we can call this one an episode. Since we're already talking about Xavier, let's discuss Thanatos, who is an obvious palette swap of him with a scythe. I think he's also got some sprite work done around his face to make it look more like a skull, but it disappears during certain animations. See, Thanatos is in fact the Greek psychopomp, but during a routine soul pickup, he was forced out of his position and into a mortal body. Thanatos became known as Vapsian, Hooter's master, and was slain by the local witch hunters. Guide Thanatos to victory, and he finds himself back on the stake, but as much as he could prevent his death, he doesn't want to. He wants his old job back. Much to his surprise, before the burning happens, he's surrounded by a swirl of sand that brings him to the Eternity Complex. The same mysterious figure that stripped him of his role has also shattered Kronos, god of time, and since Raven can't bear to leave the Eternal Champion's side, Thanatos has offered his place, which he gladly accepts. Together they hope to work toward stopping this mysterious figure. This might be the Dark Champion, killing people he ought not and causing time loops, but it also might be a teaser for the 3rd game that was planned but never came out due to Sega of Japan preferring to focus on Virtua Fighter. Our next contestant is Chin-Wo. I'm not sure why he's a secret fighter. He's got a decent story, cool unique style, ending typical of the main roster. Maybe they just didn't have the time or money to give him a full CG render like the rest? Who knows? Chin-Wo is an acupuncturist and accomplished practitioner of monkey-style kung fu, using a ring weapon a solid 10 years before Soul Calibur's Tira. Looking to challenge his prowess, Chin-Wo is asked to battle by a member of the nobility, presenting him with a difficult decision. He has too much pride to lose on purpose, but if he were to defeat the noble, he'd surely lose his life. He tries to simply refuse or ignore the request, but so hungry for conflict is this noble that he kills a street beggar and frames Chin-Wo for it, insisting he'll see the court turn a blind eye to his crimes if he just agrees to fight. Chin-Wo still refuses and pays for his pride with his life. If he's able to defeat all the other contestants in the tournament and return to life, he uses a technique taught to him by Midnight of all people. The vampire with the vampire powers caused by his vampire chemical bath and not inner ki or sorcery or whatever, to lock eyes with the noble and force him to confess his fraud. Impressed by his virtue under pressure, the people see Chin-Wo as a symbol of the common man, and the emperor himself appoints him to help restore China's integrity through reforming the courts and removing power from the aristocracy. Thomas Chavez was known to his Green Beret buddies as Blast back in 1955. He was among those running guns to support the French behind enemy lines of Vietnam before the US officially put boots on the ground. Blast was on his last mission when his pilot Redux revealed himself to be a Vietnamese double agent. After Blast had buckled himself into the seat of his helicopter, Redux pulled the pin on a grenade and dropped it into Blast's lap before evacuating. Chavez portrays what the game calls Green Beret technique, which does remind me a bit of Street Fighter's Guile, although not exactly. Long legs, straight punches similar to boxing, you get the gist. If Blast is your fighter of choice, his ending sees him swiftly planting the grenade he knows is coming in Redux's pocket, and the double agent goes to pieces a safe distance away from the chopper. Blast spends the rest of his life putting effort into rescuing prisoners of war, and when his body is no longer fit enough to do the job himself, he contributes the contents of his wallet. This, of course, earns him several awards and commendations, but to Blast, the biggest prize is seeing good soldiers safely back on their home soil, no matter their country of origin. We end on a rib, a character known only as Senator who is definitely not Joe Lieberman. See, back in the 90s, video games were really coming under fire for overblown reactions to their violent or sexual content, with concerned folks believing it was instilling degenerate values in the children.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap in particular were popular punching bags, and as you're aware by the number of home booby trap related deaths we've had since 1992, there was just cause for concern. The Senator in this game is implied to be an antagonistic figure brought into the tournament at the behest of the Dark Champion. He didn't even die an unjust death. After voting for a human rights bill his lobbyist supporters didn't feel fat in their wallets enough, he lost the election and had to foot the bill for his next campaign. When that failed, he suffered a massive heart attack and died. The Senator is an obvious edit of Larson Tyler, but he has some unique moves, like literally tying the opponent up in red tape. Should he win the tournament, he calms his heart rate and makes his concession speech, outing all of his former allies and much of the corruption in Washington. So moved by his efforts for the people of America that they called for a revote, but during the second election it came out he was involved in a politically typical number of scandals and once again lost. That suits our former senator just fine though. He made a fortune on the book and movie rights to his story, appearing on talk shows and enjoying the high life for the rest of his days. It's not as pointed as some of the Jack Thompson-inspired jabs from video game history, but it's a pretty good dunk on the misguided jackals of the time and a fine way to conclude our roster. I haven't talked about either game's mechanics, and that's because they're just good. It's in a similar echelon to Street Fighter 2, if not the turbo version. I'd say they're better than a lot of the early Mortal Kombat titles, although the fatality like Cinna-kills, overkills, and sudden deaths are a bit more difficult to trigger. The original game had a badass training room with customizable traps, a replay feature, and tournament mode, and while the sequel nixes the first two aspects, it adds even more tournament options. I wouldn't even be covering this game if it had more of a presence in the modern day, but unlike other relatively obscure franchises such as Samurai Showdown and yes, Virtua Fighter, Eternal Champions has remained on the shelf since the late 90s. Well, almost. In the original Season 0 episode, we were in the midst of rumors and screenshots swirling, teasing an Eternal Champions sequel that never took shape. Now, at time of writing, Skydance Media is paying Jurassic World writer Derek Connolly to adapt a live-action Eternal Champions film. Another Sega movie makes sense following the runaway success of the Sonic franchise, but I have to admit I'm surprised it's Eternal Champions. As brutal as the franchise's conclusion was, despite the 2 action spin-offs in Chicago Syndicate and Experts and the massive ad campaign taking place in America for the game, with Virtua Fighter, a series Sega continues to support to this day, you'd think that would be the target for the film. Either way, I look forward to it gracing our theaters and streaming services someday, even if it winds up being bad. Michael Latham himself still holds out hope for an Eternal Champions sequel or even spiritual successor, and I know I'd be over the moon to get my hands on beating booties with Xavier and Shadow once again. Next time on Violent Profiles, let's step away from the grim and bloody world of Eternal Champions and take a look at something cuter, cuddlier, and more controversial. Curious what I'm talking about? Consider subscribing to the Patreon at the $5 tier to get that and future episodes a whole month early. Your name will join the high scores currently on screen. How cool is that? At least 20% cooler than not subscribing. Until next time, white out.